official definition of female genital cutting or mutilation, or FGMC, by the World Health Organization is that it involves all procedures that involve partial or total removal of the external female genitalia or other injury to the female genital organ for non-medical reasons.
My understanding is that there are types of cutting. Could you also sort of take the audience through what are the different types of cutting as well?
Sure. So again, the World Health Organization has actually divided it into 4 types, but it's really important to recognize that these types in themselves are very broad, and each type is actually very broad. But just to go through them, they generally increase in severity. So type 1 involves what they say is usually excision of the clitoral hood or part of the clitoral hood or part of the clitoris. But again, that's a very broad range of what can happen to a girl who undergoes type 1. Then type 2 involves partial or total removal of the clitoris and the labia minora. It might also involve a part of the labia majora. So it's touching on the inner and outer lips of the vagina too. And then type 3, which is the most severe, is actually, it can involve, it's very broad too, but it can involve removal of all of the external female genitalia from the labia minora to majora to the clitoris. And sometimes what you hear about is called infibulation, where everything is sort of removed and then stitched back up. So that is generally the most severe form. Then I did mention there were 4 types. Type 4 is this other category of sorts. So that can include anything that doesn't really fit into the first 3 categories. And that includes pricking, cauterizing, piercing, so any other type. But in general, 1 through 3 range from least severe to the most severe form of female genital cutting.
There is definitely a lot of misconceptions as to, what is the origin of this practice, or, when did it all start? Has it got any religious connotation to it, or is it cultural? What is the story behind this practice?
That's a good question. There are many origins in terms of why or how it began. We have instances of it being performed on mummies from Egypt. We also have instances of where we've seen the Romans practice it on female slaves as a way to control them. But really what we do know is that it does predate the Abrahamic religion. So that means that it predates the coming of Christianity, of Islam, of Judaism as well. Today, it really is performed for a variety of reasons, and what we usually refer to as it's performed because it's been socially sanctioned with the community. So it's been found to be a social norm within various communities, and many communities emphasize one reason over another. And those various reasons can include things such as it's performed for religious requirement. In some communities, even though it isn't technically found in any of the holy books following the Abrahamic religion. So again, it's not found in the Torah, it's not found in the Bible, it's not found in the Quran. There are other religious texts amongst various communities that do include it. And so many times communities practicing it will relate to those texts, or it just in itself, the community believes that it's a religious tradition and there may be religious leaders that promote it. But we've also heard reasons of it being performed for simply because of tradition. This is something that is done generation after generation. Also, culture is a huge proponent of why this continues generation after generation. There are various myths also relating to this idea that it actually helps promote health and hygiene, or there's beliefs around sexuality, whether that means that it's important to decrease female sexuality, or coincidentally, I've actually heard communities say that what we do helps promote sexuality too. Anatomical type of beliefs in certain communities, where if you don't cut off female genitalia, the clitoris will grow to be too large, or this idea that a good girl to be able to be married must have it done too. So again, there's a wide variety, but whatever the reasoning, really it is because it's been justified in all of these different ways, and it's become a social norm in those communities. And those various reasons are what help keep it entrenched in the community, so it continues generation after generation.
Could you talk a little bit about when it comes to India, which particular community practices this the most? And, just throw some numbers as to what are the number of people that have undergone it.
And so at a global level, of the data that we have, we know that 200 million women and girls have undergone it. And that number is in itself very much an underrepresented number of the total figures in actuality. And that's because for decades, data was only being collected in about 30, now it's 32, but in about 30 countries around the world. And most of those countries were mostly within Africa and in the Middle East. A few years ago, they finally included Indonesia into the mix. And I'm mentioning this to give context around the numbers because I think it helps paint a picture in India too. But a few years ago, before they included Indonesia, which was the first country within Asia that they included, the number was 140 million. And then with the addition of just one country in Asia, Indonesia, it jumped to 200 million. And so that just shows you that there was really this underestimate in terms of recognizing that this is a global issue and that it actually affects countries everywhere, particularly within Asia, which only in the last few years has come to the global attention. Right now, there was another country, smaller country, Maldives. I think they were recently added to the official data. And I'm talking about high-level data collected at a governmental level. What we do know, though, is that it actually anecdotally, we do have research that it's found in 92 countries around the world. And this includes small-scale studies, too, by NGOs or by students, by researchers. But it's just unfortunately been ignored still at the top level in terms of by the UN. And within India, India is one of those countries that unfortunately we do not have high level data. We do not have government level data on how many people, women and girls, are affected by FGMC within the country. We do have some small scale studies that have been done over the years. Sahiyo, an organization that I co-founded with 4 other women, we were the first organization to do a larger scale study of some sort a few years ago, and we had over 400 women take part in that study. But it was a online survey that assessed how common this was within the Bora community, which is one of the communities within India that does practice this, and it is the one that it mainly practices it. Our study showed that amongst the global community, so populations were about half were from India and Pakistan, and the other half were diaspora communities of the Bora community from everywhere, including the US and Europe. That of that, I think in total we analyzed 385 women. 80% of the women had undergone FGMC. And anecdotally, that was something that we really believed was quite common. So to see that number reflected back to us, confirmed for us that this was a widespread practice within this community. A few years later, another NGO conducted a study specifically within India. It was smaller. I cannot remember the total number of women. It might have been 100 or so women, but specifically within India. And they found around 75 to 80% of the population had undergone it within India. So again, confirming that it is pretty widespread within the Bora community. Since a lot of attention has come out that this is done within India, we've heard stories of it happening in other communities as well. And a few years ago, Sahiyo heard that it was happening within Kerala too, amongst other communities, other Sunni Muslim communities, and did an investigation and was able to confirm that it happened. And since then, there have been a few women who have spoken up from those communities to talk about it happening. So one of the things that we found just in general is that this is a global issue. It's unfortunately not as well known as it should be, and that we are learning that it has been happening in other communities. It's just that we haven't heard the stories publicly yet. So India really is one of those countries where we're learning more and more information, and now it's coming to light that this is an issue within the country too.
The time and age right now, we would think that, any sort of bodily harm, whether it is stemming from a religious backdrop or a cultural backdrop, one would imagine that something like this would have, eventually just ceased to exist. I was wondering how the women within the community are feeling, because from my understanding, based on some of the books I have read and some of the anecdotal studies that I have read, like you mentioned, I understand that there is some sort of a prerogative within the women of the community in order to uphold this practice. Could you talk a little bit about that?
So this is something that you find throughout communities that are practicing it, and I'll just I'll zoom in on India and what we're finding there, and particularly amongst the Bora community, as that is actually the community I grew up in as well. So I have a little more personal experience with that community. Partly, one of the things that growing up in the Bora community, that you're taught that this is a woman's issue, you're taught you're supposed to keep silent on that. And those dynamics actually help perpetuate this form of gender violence, continuing generation after generation. Also within the community, you're really taught not to question authority. You're taught not to question teachings, and there must be a reason for things, even if you don't know them. And FGC, or Katna, or cups as it's called within the community, is one of those things that falls under all of those umbrellas, where it's just something there must be a reason, as a religious requirement. A few years ago, the main reasoning for why FGC was done that we would hear is around sexual control. We heard a lot of reasoning, but it was mostly the idea of sexual control. But now when you talk to the Bora community, that idea has kind of shifted, because I think there's a recognition that that is not an acceptable idea. So now it's really about, no, this is a religious requirement. And I think it's just, that's another note, that reasons given for why this continues can shift over time as well. So it's like politically recognizing that controlling sexuality is not appropriate to talk about, but being able to mandate that this is a religious tradition, this is our cultural or religious right, is what you are seeing people who are promoters of this practice really cling to. And I think it also just relates to this idea that if you admit this is wrong, what else could you admit in the religion is wrong too, which I think is very human nature in itself. But because, what we have been seeing is that as survivors have been speaking up, we are seeing this backlash happen where members of the community who are adherent, who very much do not want to see any fault or negative image of the community come out, are getting upset, and they are basically saying that this is our religious requirement, and kind of disregarding the effects of what has happened, the mental health, the physical health, the sexual consequences that might have happened to other women who have undergone this too. And you are seeing this organized kind of backlash actually happening from within the community. Not everyone, and I don't want to say everyone, but you do see some websites popping up about like pro FGC related. And I actually take that sort of as a good sign, because before, for a long time, there was no public discussion on this. And for me personally, I think social change can only happen if you have a public discussion. So being able to see this come out of this private realm where religious leaders would not talk about it before, and now actually seeing it being talked about, I think is a step in the right direction.
But truly, many would argue that it is also some form of erasure of female pleasure, because the organs that are being cut are essentially organs that provide females sexual pleasure. So what are your thoughts about this practice being, in fact, a form of barring women from enjoying or experiencing such pleasure?
I'm a social worker, and when I was in graduate school for social work, I did a smaller study to understand why female genital cutting was happening amongst the Bora community within the United States, because I lived in the United States. And the United States is a different context because there was a law in place that banned it. But when I did that research, and what I mentioned earlier, the reasoning, the predominant reasoning I heard for why it continued was this idea that you had to control women's sexuality, or women were not supposed to be sexual in Islam. But nowadays, that reasoning, even though that is sort of connected to why it was continuing, that reasoning is not at the forefront of proponents who are claiming this must continue. They are saying that no, this actually is for a religious reason. It does not have any impact on your sexuality in that way. And I think there is a recognition that in stating this other reasoning, that controlling sexuality is not acceptable in that same way. But you also are seeing in defense of female genital cutting, and because the Bora community in specific practices type 1, which is one of the least severe forms, you're actually getting this message that what we're doing will increase your sexuality. And it's because it's this melding of science and false facts, but this idea that if the boras are practicing one of the least severe forms, and this means that they're practicing, generally what's thought to happen in the Bora community is that you're removing part of the clitoral hood. So you're exposing the clitoris more. And if you're exposing the clitoris more, then there's more nerves. And then that means that you would enjoy sex more, basically. And then they're comparing it to this idea of clitoral rehooding, I think is what it's called, or clitoral dehooding. But it's an elective procedure that they often claim happens in the West. And like, if women are doing this in the West, why can't we do it here? Because they do that to increase sexuality. But they're ignoring the fact that many of these women were born with like extra layers of tissue and things like that, which are reason why things like that happen. But it's this melding of, again, like false facts with science to try to make it acceptable that this is okay. And like, oh, actually, it might increase your sexuality. And there are some websites that actually will claim that too. But it makes it all very complicated to talk about this issue and to like separate truth from fact. And I think recognizing, though, the bottom line is that this is happening to girls that are in the Bora community, mostly around 7, because that's the age that it usually generally happens. But it's happening to girls that have no control over their bodies. They are not old enough to consent to something actually impacting their genitalia, to something cutting there. And you do not know what the effect will be, because the clitoris does have, thousands of nerve endings. And it's impossible to know kind of the long-term impact that it could have, the emotional, the physical, the psychological impact that it can have too. And I think that's like that control in itself is something that's harmful, and it's not being recognized it's not being recognized as a form of control. It's being recognized as a religious requirement. And we need to shift that narrative to show, no, that's a form of control, because you're impacting potentially this young girl's future sexual life.
Point that you mentioned about the age in which this happens, you're as young as, say, 6 or 7. I would like you to sort of discuss the various kinds of medical ramifications, the long-term medical ramifications of this practice, in a way that we don't at all belittle the type A's, where as per they claim, the damage is like minimal.
There are definitely various physical, mental health, psychological, sexual, emotional consequences of FGMC of all kinds, regardless of the physical severity that is done. And I think it's important to note that everyone experiences this differently, because everyone is different. But from what we know of research, and unfortunately, the research that we do have mostly involves the more severe forms of FGMC, so type 2 and type 3 generally. But we do know that physically, some consequences they can start right after the cut. So it can be anything from like bleeding to chronic infection, to pain during urination, during menstruation, during sexual intercourse. Mental health, emotionally, it can relate to PTSD, which can relate to like poor sleep and fatigue, body pain, or like your own self-esteem kind of being affected, and your own well-being, to trust issues as well too. But there is a wide range. The more severe forms have also found difficulty in childbearing and childbirth, not bearing, but childbirth as well. But I think it's important to recognize too that this idea that there isn't data on the least severe forms, or as much data as there should be, is also used against us in terms of trying to advocate against this practice and trying to educate communities to give it away. I've actually had personal experiences where I've done like educational events, and I had a member of the community actually ask that question, like, if this is so harmful, then why isn't there data showing that it's so harmful? And I think that takes away the subjective experience of survivors, but also takes away it doesn't recognize how complicated it is to get high-level governmental data. It's just a very politicalized issue. We also just don't have enough data on the long-term mental health consequences, and that's for all forms. And that is something that has been a topic of conversation in the last few years amongst many organizations working on this issue, and amongst many survivors and activists too, that we need more mental health research, because this is something, regardless of the form that is practiced, many people come away telling us about that, how they have trust issues, how they can't concentrate relating to depression, a lot of different types of situations. It's not a one-time consequence. It's something that can impact a girl throughout the course of her lifetime in various different ways.
I just want to bring it to you now. I would like to understand what is your background in founding this fabulous organization called Sahiyo, which is against female genital cutting. I would like you to talk a little bit about, why you founded it, and what is the purpose of an organization like this, and if you can sort of take it from there to talk about what are the different kind of positive impact your organization has had in either educating people or in order to mitigate damage, if you will.
I grew up in the United States. I was born and raised here, but my family is from India, and I've shared my story publicly. I've undergone it. I've had a lot of friends and family that have undergone it too. So I've always been aware of FGC within the Bora community, regardless of where you lived, whether it's India and the US. I was aware that it was continuing. I didn't really actually think about it until I was in high school at some point, and a friend of mine who grew up in the Bora community with me was talking about female genital mutilation, and then mentioned that the Bora community practiced it. And I didn't connect the idea of Khatna, what we call it, to FGM until that moment. And after that, I started doing a lot more research around this issue. And in college, I did research. And then when I was in graduate school for social work, I wanted to do more research, because I recognized that there just wasn't a lot of information out there about it happening outside the African context at that point in time. And so I put together this exploratory study to understand really why was it happening, what were the reasons, how did the community itself justify continuing it, why did it feel so important. And I felt like for me, I did that to better understand myself why this was happening, but also recognizing as a social worker and any other frontline professionals, healthcare providers, child protective services, anybody who came in contact with women who had undergone this or girls who underwent this would need that knowledge to be able to work with them. I published my thesis in 2010, but there really just wasn't anything out there at the time within the Bora community. And then I mentioned that because one of the pieces that I wrote was published by the Global Fund for Women, and two of the other co-founders of Sahiyo, Arifa Johori and Priya Goswami, they actually found that piece, and then they contacted me. And so then we started talking more about this issue and what we could do. And eventually they connected with the other two members who became the co-founders of Sahiyo. And one of the first things we decided we needed to do was to provide some sort of numbers or statistics in terms of like, how common is this within the community? We all thought it was pretty common. Two of the more important facts from that study, and one of them I mentioned, was that 80% of the women had undergone it. The other important statistic we found from there was that 81% said they did not want this to continue into the next generation. And that was mind-boggling to us in terms of, well, if so many people don't want it to continue, then why is it continuing? And that's what really helped us realize it's because it's a social norm. It's because even when community members might not agree with the practice, there's this idea, it's in social psychology, it's called pluralistic ignorance, but this idea that everyone is doing it, even though nobody wants to do it. So because of that, everyone does it. It's the social pressure idea. And you hear that oftentimes. We've heard many stories of where a mother might not want to have it done, but then it's like her mother or her aunt or some other women are the enforcers, or like, no, this has to happen. So you hear lots of stories like that too. And we recognize that I think another reason why this is happening is because no one is talking about the fact that they don't want it to happen. And so based on that, we really started to realize that we need to share stories publicly. We need people to talk about this publicly. Like that is the only way that change is going to happen. And that's really how Sahiyo came about. And we recognized that, we started a blog, we started various storytelling programs where we have one of our programs is called the Voices to End FGMC, where people come together to create their own digital stories that can be shared as advocacy tools. There are various videos, and they can talk about whatever aspect they want to talk about. They can talk about what it was like to be cut. They can talk about the complicated relationship with their mother because she had them cut. They can talk about, we have men involved now. There was somebody who talked about learning about it happening to his sister and how that impacted, he never realized it impacted their relationship growing up. So just really widening the scope of the conversation. We've had people on our blog, sons that have opened up conversations with their mothers and talked about this, and they've written about what that was like. And it's just, as we were sharing more of these stories in these various programs, and we were doing in-person programs too, where we'd get people together and talk about this issue. But it was inspiring other people to talk about this. And then we eventually started hearing from other communities too. So, we started with the Bora community, but we've expanded to many other communities. That's huge for us. It's just the fact to see in these few short years, how many people are talking about this publicly and how much we have learned in terms of how global this issue is. And in some ways that is sad, but in other ways, it's like we're uncovering the reality that it's not that it just suddenly started in all these communities. It's been there, but it's just never been recognized. And the fact that we're recognizing it now means we can do something about it. So we've, it's amazing to see that. It's amazing to see every year how many more people are reaching out to us who want to get involved, who want to do some sort of work, who are sharing their stories, or who are, or just even maybe not sharing their stories publicly, but talking to a member in their family about it, which maybe they never felt like they could before. And then we hear stories about people saying they've talked to relatives who were on the fence and then decided not to, and it's just, all those stories are things that keep us motivated, and we are seeing change happening. It's not this, I think people forget that change takes time. It's not something that's overnight, but it's a movement, and we are seeing both this recognition that current survivors need support in various ways, and everybody's different in terms of what they need support with, but also this need to do prevention work. So this need to do education and have conversations within the community, and those things are just amazing to see that happening at this growing level too.
If people were to reach out to you, in supporting your work, and they could be from the community or not, it's just that your advocacy is something that inspires them and they want to contribute in some form of, some way or the other. How can they contribute, and what would those, if it is funds, what would it go towards? Do you also provide mental health support to the survivors? What is it that people can support?
Yeah, you can support Sahiyo. Great question. In many ways, we are always looking for volunteers. Our opportunities are remote. They were remote before the pandemic hit. So we definitely are looking for volunteers who want to help us from anything from like the back end admin work to just helping us plan. I have volunteers helping us plan webinars, educational webinars right now. Then we have volunteers that don't really know what to do, but want to do things like just proofing things. Like we're an organization, so we need help with a variety of things. So we love remote volunteers. Then obviously funding, we're always in need of funding. If you are interested, if you're India based and you're interested in donating to Sahiyo India, contact us, and I can give our email address, but it's info@sahiyo.com. On that, we will eventually have an online donation button for Sahiyo India. It's just taking us a little bit of time to get that together, but donations are definitely accepted and appreciated because we can't do our various work without that. And in terms of what they would be donating toward, we happen to have piloted a virtual workshop. We usually do those in person, but we piloted a virtual one last summer. And right now, because of the pandemic, we know how to do it virtually, and we had about 10 people who took part in that one, and they really loved it. So I think we're going to continue that format just to make sure that everyone's safe, but to also be able to have people connect because of the challenging global situation that we're living in right now. We have a virtual events from like a peer support survivor group to an activist retreat, which consists of community members and survivors who want to become advocates. And so really helping them think about strategies and tools and how they can talk to their own networks and their own family members and really make a difference there. We have our blog, which supports many different, that's another way you can contribute to. Many survivors share their stories there, but we're also looking for others who want to just talk about the issue in a different way. Maybe they heard something on the news and they want to do a reflection on it. We have a series of educational webinars coming out slowly, from everything from the importance of education, FGC in educational curriculum, to one of our future ones hopefully will be using arts to talk about FGC too.
In the aspect of, trying to reach out to a wide variety of people in the community, there's often, with any form of advocacy, there's a challenge of reaching out to the most marginalized of a certain community. So I'm wondering, how extended are these programs in order to make sure that, say, women that are not educated, women belonging to the bottom of the pyramid,
people who might not have access to that technology, we've thought about programming where we can create little, more like periodicals or informational booklets. We haven't had funding to do that project. We've tried to get funding in the past, and right now it's just, again, because of the time that we're in, we're not able to pursue those projects, but we hopefully can in the future. There's some research that came out a year or two ago about social change movements, and it really said that to create social change, any movement, you need to reach 25% of that community. So you need to create what's known as a critical mass of voices, because once you can get to that 25%, that critical mass, that's when a tipping point happens. And that's when those who might be the most marginalized, those who might be the most against a certain situation might start leaning in more too. So like all of our programming is all about reaching that critical mass, like getting to that tipping point. So where we can see that this idea of FTC being a social norm that has to continue, our hope is that it flips to this idea that it's something that doesn't have to continue. And that's what the majority of people will come to think.
The 81% of people that wish that this would stop, I wish that that number would go up to 100. And we do indeed see that it comes to an end at some point in our generation.